Last thing, Alyssa Slotkin, senator from Michigan, she said you shouldn't be using oligarch. It's over people's head. You've gotten criticized from other people. Free Beacon says Bernie Sanders spent $221,000 on private jets fighting the Oligarchy tour, paid for by friends of Bernie Sanders. That you've spent millions of dollars in campaign funds on private jet travel over the years. How do you push back on both of those things?
When's the last time you saw Donald Trump during a campaign mode at National Airport?
No, it doesn't. But he's also not fighting the oligarchy.
No. You run a campaign and you do 3 or 4 or 5 rallies in a week. The only way you can get around to talk to 30,000 people. Think I'm going to be sitting on a waiting line at United, waiting, 30,000 people are waiting? That's the only way you can get around. No apologies for that. That's what campaign travel is about. We've done it in the past. We're going to do it in the future.
Now imagine this for a moment. A man who rails against the wealthy elite, who calls for a political revolution, who insists that the 1% are the root of all systemic evil, is flying coast to coast on a private jet, paid for by wealthy donors, to give speeches about ending wealth inequality. You might think this is just hypocrisy, but I'd argue it's far deeper than that. This is the embodiment of an ancient archetype, the false prophet, a man who adopts the mask of virtue, not to serve the truth, but to serve himself. So let's break it down, not just politically, but psychologically, mythologically, and morally. Because if we don't recognize these patterns when they appear, we risk empowering the very tyrannies we claim to fear. Let's begin with the basic facts. In what has now become a widely covered moment of political irony, Senator Bernie Sanders spent over $200,000 on private jet travel for a speaking tour, ironically titled Fighting the Oligarchy. The funding, as it turns out, came from an organization called Friends of Bernie Sanders. This isn't satire. This isn't exaggeration. It's public record. Now, I don't bring this up to obsess over flight preferences. I'm not suggesting that a public figure can never use a private plane. That's not the point. The point, the contradiction, is that Sanders wasn't just flying. He was flying to denounce the very privileges that made that flight possible. Think about the symbolism. A man denouncing the elite, soaring above the working class in a luxury jet while telling them how unfair their lives are. That's not just a contradiction. It's a betrayal of narrative integrity. See, in mythological terms, the hero must be willing to descend, to confront chaos, to sacrifice comfort for meaning. But what we see here is the opposite. Comfort without sacrifice, privilege without price, message without alignment. If you preach sacrifice but live indulgence, you are not a leader, you're a manipulator. And if you demand the dismantling of power while simultaneously enjoying its perks, you're not revolutionary, you're aristocracy in disguise. Bernie's defenders say this is logistics, that in order to reach 30,000 people in a week, he had to fly private. But that's exactly the problem. He wants the rewards of revolution without the cost. He wants to appear as the man of the people, while living as the man above them. The real concern here isn't the jet, it's the justification, the psychological ease with which he absolves himself of the very moral code he imposes on others. When called out, he didn't apologize. He rationalized. He said, "That's what campaign travel is about. In other words, the rules don't apply to me because my cause is just." That is the root of tyranny, the belief that one's noble intentions grant them license to act without restraint. It's the gateway drug to totalitarianism. It starts with, "I deserve this," and ends with, "So do you." This is where the idea of the false prophet emerges. A true prophet suffers for his truth. He lives humbly. He walks the path he asks others to walk. But the false prophet, he ascends the pulpit, shouts about injustice, and then steps into a chauffeured limo paid for by the very system he condemns, and millions cheer. Why? Because the appearance of virtue is often more comforting than the reality of truth, because narrative is more addictive than nuance. And because we've forgotten that integrity isn't about what you say, it's about whether you live it. To truly understand what's at play here, you have to move beyond politics and into psychology, specifically the archetypal psychology laid out by Carl Jung. Jung believed that human beings play out ancient stories, archetypes embedded deep in the collective unconscious. The false prophet is one of them. This figure appears throughout history. He speaks in the name of justice. He claims to speak for the voiceless. He demands sacrifice, but only from others. And most importantly, he uses morality as a weapon to gain influence and shield himself from criticism. When a man cloaks his ambition in moral language, that's not virtue, it's camouflage. And when a society rewards that, it's no longer a democracy, it's a stage play. The false prophet isn't evil in the way a villain is evil. He's seductive. He presents as righteous, angry, passionate, fighting for the oppressed. But underneath, there's something else, resentment masquerading as justice. In Jungian terms, resentment is what occurs when a person fails to integrate their shadow. Instead of acknowledging their own capacity for greed, power hunger, or vanity, they project those flaws onto others. In this case, the rich, the 1%, the oligarchs. It's psychologically easier to condemn the rich than to examine your own motivations. But if you lie to yourself about your own ambition, you'll convince yourself you're saving the world while you're actually just feeding your ego. Bernie Sanders' rhetoric is filled with emotionally charged villains. But the more he preaches revolution, the less willing he seems to apply those standards to his own behavior. He says billionaires are the problem, but he travels like one. He says power corrupts, but he's built a career on cultivating a cult of personality. He says the people come first, but flies over them, literally, on a jet paid for by wealthy donors. That's not leadership. That's archetypal disintegration. That's a man at war with his own contradictions, refusing to acknowledge them and instead building a movement on moral projection. And the danger here is not just personal, it's cultural, because the false prophet archetype always appears during times of social unrest, when people are angry, afraid, and desperate for meaning. He doesn't solve problems. He exploits suffering to consolidate influence. When people are emotionally vulnerable, they will follow the person who speaks most loudly, not the one who speaks most truthfully. That's how societies fall, not from a lack of policies, but from a lack of truth, from people losing the ability to distinguish between a prophet and a performance artist, between a savior and a salesman. And this brings us directly to the next layer of deception, the manipulation of language itself. Words matter, but only if they mean something. And that's where this gets more insidious. Bernie Sanders and his ideological peers frequently use terms like equity, justice, oligarchy, and democratic socialism. But ask them to define these words clearly, and you'll often get vague, emotional, or circular definitions. When people use undefined words to stir emotion rather than explain reality, they are not informing you. They are manipulating you. The term oligarchy, for instance, is used to evoke fear and moral urgency. It's meant to conjure images of cigar-smoking billionaires hoarding wealth and oppressing the poor. But here's the problem. In Sanders' framework, everyone with wealth becomes an oligarch, except his own wealthy backers. That's not justice. That's tribalism with better PR. When you refuse to define your terms, you can apply them selectively. You can call one rich man an oppressor and another a supporter. You can excuse hypocrisy because your side means well. That's not politics. That's emotional warfare. Language divorced from truth becomes a tool of tyranny. If you can redefine wealth as evil but still accept donations, if you can demonize power but crave its privileges, you're not fighting injustice, you're manipulating perception. And the deeper danger is cultural erosion. Because once a society accepts that intention is more important than outcome, and that emotion is more valid than definition, then truth becomes subjective. Anyone can claim the moral high ground as long as they cry loud enough. This is why Jordan Peterson insists on precise language. Because when language breaks down, so does society. If the word justice means whatever makes me feel good, then it means nothing. If equity means punishing success instead of lifting the disadvantaged, then it becomes a tool for envy. You cannot have a civilized society built on emotional slogans. You need clarity, you need definitions, you need a shared understanding of what words mean. And yet, in the rhetoric of the modern left, words are fluid, especially when they become inconvenient. Oligarchy applies to tech billionaires unless they're donating. Equity applies to outcomes unless those outcomes hurt their voting base. Justice applies to their enemies, not to their allies. This isn't the pursuit of moral clarity. It's verbal sleight of hand. And when a leader uses unclear language to excuse clear hypocrisy, it's no longer a political issue. It's a psychological and cultural crisis. Because a man who bends words to suit his agenda can bend anything, truth, reality, ethics, until nothing remains but power. There's a principle in every serious religious and moral tradition, ancient, enduring, and undeniable. Virtue requires sacrifice. You cannot be virtuous without giving something up. Comfort, ego, status, security. The act of doing what's right has a cost. That's what separates it from self-interest. And this is where Bernie Sanders' entire public persona collapses. He claims the mantle of virtue, defender of the poor, destroyer of the rich, champion of the working class. But where's the sacrifice? Where's the willingness to live modestly? Where's the decision to fly commercial with the people he claims to represent? Where's the gesture, however symbolic, of sharing the struggle? The man who asks others to sacrifice but refuses to do so himself is not a moral leader. He is a tyrant in training. Sanders had choices. He could have used digital platforms to reach people. He could have sent surrogates. He could have flown commercial and used the opportunity as a symbol of authenticity. But he didn't. He chose luxury. He chose speed. He chose optics, not principle. That decision reveals his real priorities. Not the poor, not the oppressed, not even the revolution. His priority was efficiency, comfort, and perhaps most importantly, image. This is a man who constantly rails against consumerism, corporate excess, and the privileged lifestyle of the elite. And yet, given the opportunity, he embraces all three, then rationalizes it away as necessary. Necessary for what? For whom? The uncomfortable truth is this: Bernie Sanders' moral framework collapses the moment he has to apply it to himself. Virtue, when untested, is just theory, and the true test of moral integrity is not when it's easy to be good, but when being good costs you something. In ancient mythology, the hero must enter the underworld. He must confront the dragon, descend into chaos, and emerge with truth. But Bernie doesn't descend. He flies above. He calls others to the fire while standing in the shade. This isn't virtue. It's a simulation of virtue, a carefully curated aesthetic of sacrifice presented to those too hungry for meaning to ask what's really being offered. And it's not just Sanders. It's a pattern we've seen across movements that preach radical change with luxury tools. Climate activists flying to conferences in private jets, socialist politicians dining in private clubs. The ideology says one thing, the lifestyle says another. You don't get to ask the world to change if you won't change your schedule. You don't get to demand sacrifice if you haven't first learned to endure discomfort. If Bernie Sanders truly believes in the revolution he preaches, then he must live it. Otherwise, he's not building a better world. He's profiting from the fantasy of one. And that brings us to the next mechanism behind this deception: the psychology of performance, power, and image. We live in a culture of performance. Politicians no longer lead, they brand. They don't speak truth, they craft narrative. And nowhere is this more evident than in the obsession with image. Bernie Sanders, despite his rough-around-the-edges persona, is deeply aware of the power of optics. The private jet isn't just about speed, it's about status. It signals urgency, it implies importance. It elevates him, literally and metaphorically, above the masses. It says, I'm too important to wait in line, too vital to fly commercial, too needed to take a bus. The moment you prioritize how you appear over who you are, you've entered the domain of narcissism, not leadership. Flying private while calling out privilege is not just hypocrisy, it's a performance paradox. It reveals a disturbing psychological truth. Sanders knows that people respond more to spectacle than substance. He knows the crowd will cheer louder if he looks presidential, if he looks revolutionary, if he arrives like the hero in a movie. And this works because as human beings, we are wired to respond to symbols. A man descending from a plane, waving to a crowd, framed by banners of justice justice and slogans of equity, that looks like a savior. But it's only that, a look, a pose. Strip away the optics, and what do we have? A politician funded by elites, indulging in luxury while scolding others for excess. This is the trap of modern politics. We mistake symbolism for substance. And politicians like Sanders have learned how to exploit that. A lie told with enough theatrical conviction can feel more real than the truth, especially when it confirms what you want to believe. Bernie doesn't just campaign, he performs morality, he cosplays humility, he markets rage, and the private jet becomes part of that stagecraft. It gives him credibility, ironically, by presenting him as a man in motion, a revolutionary on the move. But it also insulates him, shields him, elevates him above criticism, because if you question the means, he points back to the message. It's not about how I get there, he says. It's about what I'm saying when I arrive. But in Peterson's framework, that's not good enough. You don't separate the means from the message, because how you act is your message. And if your method requires contradiction, deceit, and indulgence, then you've already corrupted the very ideals you claim to fight for. You cannot build a tower of truth on a foundation of lies. You cannot speak for the oppressed while living as the privileged. And you cannot play the savior while behaving like a king. In the end, the private jet is not the scandal. It's the symbol. A symbol of a deeper psychological problem. The elevation of image over integrity and performance over principle. And that leads us to the next question. Who funds this performance and why? Let's ask the uncomfortable question. Who exactly is paying for the revolution? In the case of Sanders' Fight the Oligarchy tour, the private jet expenses, over $200,000, were reportedly covered by a political action committee called Friends of Bernie Sanders. That phrase should make you pause, because who are these friends? They're not farmers from rural Vermont. They're not unionized laborers scraping to pay rent. These are wealthy donors, individuals with the means, connections, and capital to fund high-speed political theater across the country. And that reveals the great unspoken truth. Every revolutionary has a sponsor, and when that sponsor is part of the elite class you claim to oppose, you are not dismantling power. You're being subsidized by it. Sanders rails against billionaires and oligarchs, but he has his own network of elites. He just calls them allies. They don't fly in jets alone, they book them for him, and in return, he offers moral absolution. He blesses their wealth as justified because it's being spent for the cause. This is how the false prophet operates. He doesn't reject the power structures. He integrates with them, but frames it as moral exception. It's the same dynamic we've seen time and time again. The climate crusader flying private to a sustainability summit. The social justice leader selling $80 sweatshirts while preaching equity. The socialist celebrity living in a gated mansion while demanding wealth redistribution. The behavior isn't new. What's new is the linguistic shield used to justify it. Friends, allies, supporters. These are rhetorical cloaks for what is, in reality, an elite political machine. Beware of the man who claims purity while sitting at the table of kings. He will tell you he's there to speak truth, but he's staying for the dessert. This isn't grassroots. It's designer revolution. Tailored, curated, and bankrolled by the very forces it claims to detest. But that contradiction is not just tolerated by followers, it's embraced. Because people want to believe. They want to believe the prophet is genuine. And so they excuse the jet, the donors, the hypocrisy. They tell themselves, well, he needs the money to fight the system. But if the system is funding him, is he really fighting it, or is he merely playing the part? This reveals the danger of tying morality to intentions instead of actions. Sanders intends to do good, therefore his methods are excused. His alliances are forgiven. His indulgences are strategic. But that's how corruption begins. Not in a dark room, but in a justified compromise. Now we must ask, why is this tolerated? Why can someone like Bernie Sanders build an empire on contradiction and still be viewed as a moral authority? The answer is not just political, it's cultural. We've created a society where symbolism is more important than substance, where a well-delivered speech means more than a well-lived life, and where emotional resonance is valued above logical consistency. We have substituted narrative for knowledge. We have trained an entire generation to respond to slogans, not arguments, to feelings, not facts. This begins in our education system. Universities no longer teach economic literacy. They teach economic resentment. Students aren't taught how wealth is created. They're taught that its very existence is immoral. And so when someone like Sanders stands up and says, the rich are the enemy, it feels right. It sounds just. It offers a simple villain in a complex world. But this is how demagogues rise, not by offering real solutions, but by offering someone to blame. The media plays its part too. When a conservative spends donor money on luxury travel, the outrage is immediate and merciless. But when Sanders does the same, it's reframed as logistical necessity. It's not hypocrisy, it's strategy. The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves to protect our heroes, because those lies become ideology. And when ideology replaces truth, you no longer have politics, you have dogma. We've built echo chambers so deep that truth cannot reach the bottom, and inside those chambers, even contradiction becomes holy. There's also a psychological phenomenon at work: moral projection. People want to feel like they're doing something good, but that's hard. That requires effort, humility, and personal sacrifice. So instead, they attach themselves to someone who appears to be doing good. They chant the slogans, they wear the buttons, they repost the speeches, and in doing so, they feel moral without actually confronting the complexity of real morality. This is the appeal of the false prophet. He sells morality wholesale in easy prepackaged slogans, and as long as he looks angry enough and sounds righteous enough, no one questions the jet he flies in on. This is why Sanders can preach against elites while being funded by them. It's why he can call for economic justice while living like a statesman, because people aren't listening to his contradictions. They're listening to their own emotional confirmation. When the culture no longer values truth, it elevates theatrics. When people stop reading history, they start repeating it. And when they idolize the false prophet, they tear down the institutions that kept them free. This isn't just about Bernie Sanders. He is a symptom. The real disease is our collective abandonment of discernment. We've lost the ability to recognize the difference between authentic leadership and charismatic deception, between the one who sacrifices for the truth and the one who weaponizes it for influence. Until we rediscover that difference, the stage will always belong to the best performer, not the most principled. There's an ancient emotional force at the root of many destructive ideologies: envy. Envy isn't just wanting what someone else has. It's resenting them for having it. It's the desire not to elevate yourself to their level, but to pull them down to yours. And envy, once moralized, becomes one of the most toxic political weapons imaginable. When you build a worldview on envy, you aren't trying to make the poor richer. You're trying to make the rich poorer. And that's not justice. That's vengeance in disguise. This is the engine behind Bernie Sanders' rhetoric. His message isn't about encouraging personal excellence, entrepreneurship, or wealth creation. It's not about competence or resilience. It's about demonizing success and romanticizing resentment. The problem isn't that there are billionaires. The problem in his framework is that some people have more than others, regardless of how that wealth was acquired, regardless of what value they brought into the world. Now imagine building national policy around that idea. We don't have to imagine it, actually. We've seen it. Venezuela followed a very similar path. Preach economic justice, mobilize envy, demonize wealth, seize control, collapse under the weight of redistributed misery. They achieved equality, all right, not by lifting the poor, but by flattening the rich. And this is where the false prophet becomes dangerous, because he doesn't preach discipline, productivity, or delayed gratification, tools required to escape poverty. He preaches blame. He tells people that their suffering isn't due to circumstance, choices, or structural complexity. It's because someone else has what they don't. That message is psychologically seductive because it requires no responsibility, and where there is no responsibility, there can be no growth. A society that moralizes envy will eventually legislate it, and when you legislate envy, you punish success. You demonize innovation. You strangle the very mechanisms that create opportunity in the first place. That's the dark irony here. The false prophet claims to fight for the poor while attacking the engines that could empower them. And that's not compassion, it's sabotage, but it's sold as justice because it feels good, because it feeds a psychological hunger for validation and revenge, because anger is easier than effort. Real justice is hard. It means accepting uncomfortable truths. It means encouraging people to improve rather than enabling them to blame. And it means telling the truth even when it costs you the crowd. Bernie's message doesn't demand growth from the individual. It doesn't offer tools for change. It offers a villain to hate and a scapegoat to punish. But once you hand moral authority to envy, you don't elevate the poor, you weaponize them. And when that happens, the false prophet no longer needs to produce results. All he needs is rage, and all he needs to stay in power is an endless supply of enemies. That is how civilizations unravel, not through conquest from without, but through the corrosion of truth and the elevation of resentment within. Let's pause and ask a fundamental question. What is the real danger of a false prophet? It's not the hypocrisy. It's not even the bad policy. It's that people begin to confuse moral performance for moral reality. They begin to equate volume with virtue, anger with authenticity, and emotion with truth. If you lie long enough, publicly, passionately, and without apology, people will eventually stop noticing it's a lie. They'll just accept it as the price of good intentions. And that's the tipping point, because once a society accepts moral contradiction from its leaders, it slowly stops expecting integrity at all. The false prophet trains the public to tolerate double standards, and that's more dangerous than corruption. It's corruption normalized. It creates a culture where you can demand sacrifice from others, but never yourself. You can condemn wealth while flying in luxury. You can preach equity while living in elite exclusivity. And worst of all, you can do all of that without consequence, so long as you wrap it in moral language. This isn't new. History is littered with figures who claim to save the people while secretly using them as tools for personal or ideological gain. They didn't need to be right. They just needed to sound righteous, because when results no longer matter and only symbolism survives, power becomes a matter of who shouts the loudest, not who lives the truest. The real danger is not that people like Sanders exist. It's that we stop caring whether they live by the very standards they demand from the rest of us. And that danger expands with every cheer that excuses hypocrisy, with every voter who says, well, he means well, while ignoring how he behaves, with every journalist who covers for contradiction, and with every institution that rewards performance over principle. When public discourse is shaped by resentment, not reason, by dogma, not debate, by emotion, not evidence, you don't get progress. You get polarization, you get decay, you get collapse. Because if morality becomes subjective and leadership becomes performative, then truth itself becomes irrelevant. A society that tolerates false prophets will, in time, silence the true ones. And when that happens, the collapse is not political, it's spiritual. This isn't just about Bernie. He is an avatar of a cultural shift. He is a symptom, not the disease. But if the symptom is cheered, rewarded, and multiplied, then the sickness spreads, and the cost of ignoring it is far greater than any private jet expense. It is the loss of moral clarity, and that, history shows us, leads nowhere good. We've explored the contradictions, we've exposed the performance, we've mapped the psychology of the false prophet. But now comes the harder question: what do we do about it? The answer doesn't begin in Washington. It doesn't begin with the media. It doesn't even begin with Bernie Sanders. It begins with you. Because the antidote to the false prophet is not louder outrage. It's discernment, the ability to see through moral performance and recognize genuine character, the willingness to ask not just what someone says, but how they live. You cannot outsource your moral judgment. You have to take on the responsibility of discernment, painfully, rigorously, and personally. This means you must pay attention to actions over words, to sacrifice over slogans, to truth over theatrics. Ask yourself, does this person live the values they promote? Do they model the discipline they preach? Do they accept responsibility or merely assign blame? Because no system, social, political, or economic, can survive if its foundation is hypocrisy wrapped in moral flair. You also have to start where you are. Clean your room, organize your life, speak the truth, live with integrity. These aren't just mantras. They're survival principles in a culture that increasingly confuses meaning with marketing. Before you fix the world, make sure you've fixed yourself, otherwise you're just another hypocrite shouting in the crowd. Demand better from leaders, but demand even more from yourself, because the false prophet only rises when the people stop asking hard questions. And what of the crowd, the millions who cheer for him? They aren't stupid, they're starving for meaning, for identity, for direction. And the only way to break the spell of the false prophet is to offer something real in his place. Truth, responsibility, sacrifice, competence. These are the pillars of civilization, not rage, not envy, not performance. So don't follow the man who points fingers. Follow the one who takes responsibility. Don't worship the one who preaches division. Listen to the one who embodies discipline. Don't be seduced by the prophet who tells you what you want to hear. Learn from the teacher who tells you what you need to hear. Because if you spend more time condemning wealth than understanding how it's created, if you care more about appearing virtuous than doing what is right, and if you follow the man who speaks for the people but lives like a king, then you've already sold your soul and the price was applause.